Last week we talked about Isaac, who is Jacob's father. In the story of Isaac, we talked about some of the ways in which he was a passive character, especially at times where we wish he might have been more active. Jacob, on the other hand, is an incredibly dynamic and active character. And you may see that as we work through that story, there's probably a lot of times that we want to say to Jacob, whoa, buddy, hold your horses. You don't need to get involved there. You don't need to act this way. This contrast is striking. But Jacob has a series of great moments and a series of poorer moments. But what runs constant throughout his story is really two things. One is that God is faithful to his covenant, and God is going to work through Jacob, no matter what he does, no matter what mistakes he makes, to continue the work that God is going to do in creating his people in this land. And the other constant is that Jacob has a problem with manipulation. He is a manipulator. He both manipulates and gets manipulated. I kind of wish, I kind of wish I had a good 3 hours to walk through the story of Jacob. Because if you were to follow the text, you would see how often Jacob does something to someone and then has it done back to him, and how happy he is when he wins and how indignant he is when someone else does it to him. The way the story is written is brilliant. It comes about to show in some ways that what goes around comes around. And Jacob both wins the game of manipulation and he loses the game of manipulation. But manipulating really has no winner, save for the fact that God is at work behind it all. And so the story of Jacob and Esau begins with a little bit of overlap from last week where we were at. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, is pregnant with twins. She's going to have 2 boys, and she recognizes that there's a battle happening within her womb, and she turns to God and says, "What is going on in here?" And God gives her an imagination and a word to believe that what is happening is that the two are wrestling, and that there will be a bit of a turning around of the way things should be. The younger is God's plan. The second born will be the one who the older serves. The second born will be the one through whom the covenant is carried out through. And so Jacob and Esau are born, and the two of them turn out quite differently. Esau is the picture of ancient masculinity. He's hairy and strong, and he hunts. And we're told that Isaac, the father, loves the taste of wild game. So Esau is his favorite. Rebekah, armed with this word from God himself, prefers Jacob. Jacob, we're told, is soft and domestic. You could rub his skin and imagine that he's dipped himself in some oil of Olay. It's easy to tell the difference between the two of them, and the ancient world would certainly tend to prefer an Esau. But Jacob has a mother who's willing to fight on his behalf. And so she is likely telling him all along that he is the favored one. He is the one who God has revealed the covenant will be passed through. And so Jacob begins acting as if he is the favored child, waiting for opportunities to manipulate his father and brother. The first comes in the form of his brother on death's door. He's been out fighting, perhaps fighting and hunting in a day quite like today. Warm, hot. Who wants to be outside in that? He comes back dehydrated, exhausted, and he sees his brother, Jacob, cooking the meat that he caught. He's making a nice stew, probably making it for his dad, who enjoys the taste of the wild meat. And when he sees Esau doubled over, nearing death, struggling, he greets his brother, and his brother says, "I'm dying. Get me something to drink and something to eat so I can have strength again." Now, for those of you who have brothers and sisters, typically this is where you say, "My sibling is dying, I've got to help them." Not Jacob. Jacob says, "This is my chance." And he says, "Esau, that looks like a very difficult illness you have there." I tell you what, if you give me your birthright, I'll prepare whatever food and drink you possibly want. And Esau understands in that moment that his choice is such that he dies or he gives over the birthright. What is better, to die and have your brother take the birthright, or to live and have your brother take the birthright? Esau is manipulated. And so he makes the agreement and sells his birthright for a bowl of soup. Even though it amounts for his life, the cost seems so small. We're told at that point that Esau then despised his birthright. Life carries on for them, and Jacob probably just gets more and more haughty. He is the recipient of the birthright. He has outfoxed his strong and gruff and preferable and older brother. As time carries on, Isaac comes up against death's door, and Rebekah comes and finds Jacob and says, "Now's the moment. You put in the kill shot on your brother. We will end him, and you will be the favored one. When he's out hunting for his dad, go in to your blind father and receive his blessing." Jacob protests. "There's no way I could get away with it. He'll feel my oil of Olay hands and know that I am not my hairy brother." Rebekah says, "I've thought about this before. We'll wrap you in furs that we have. We'll spray you down with the smell of deer urine. You will smell and feel like a man." And so Jacob goes in just like this into his father's tent in his dying moments, blind, frail, weak, easily manipulated. And Jacob does just that. When Isaac calls out for Esau, Jacob says, "It's me." He reaches for his hand and feels hair, and he pronounces his blessing over Jacob. "All of my wealth, all of my family, God's very covenantal blessing is yours." Esau returns from fighting. He got to smell just like Jacob the natural way. He returns looking for his blessing. He walks up to the tent and finds that it's already happened and that Jacob has stolen it. Now, Jacob may be able to manipulate a situation, but he cannot take Esau in a fight. So he has one option and one option only, and that is to run. And Rebekah tells him to go back and find my family. Look for Laban. Find my brother. He'll take care of you. So Jacob runs into hiding, and Esau is furious and decides he's going to chase him. But first, again, I don't understand these marital patterns of the ancient world, but Esau decides he's going to make his dad pay by going to those Canaanite women and having babies with them. Something about the Canaanite women that makes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob angry. But sure enough, Esau begins to sin outside of the family in order to upset the line that he has received. Jacob, however, goes back to his family and tries to continue the line. On his way to the family, Jacob is alone. He's running from his angry brother. He's in an exile, a wilderness. He's alone, and he has nothing but a stone to sleep on. So he grabs a stone, puts his head on it in a pillow, and he falls into a deep sleep. And in this sleep, alone, in exile, running for his life, God finds him and speaks to him. And we're going to read that text today from Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 22. And I invite those of you in here with me, would you stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord today? This is the story of Jacob's dream, or as you may have heard it called, Jacob's ladder as well. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, and with its top reaching the heavens. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to the Lord's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me will be a tenth." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. It's almost hard to imagine this scene. What does a stairway to heaven, a ladder from this earth to the other world, possibly look like? I saw a video floating around Facebook, and I wonder if you did as well, that reminded me of just what seems like the scariness of reaching from the safety of strong land to the heavens. Check this out and see if this gives you some imagination. Now, how many of you would be willing to climb those stairs? Very nice. And how many of you are absolute no's? Absolute no's. For those of you watching online, we got about 2/3 no's and 1/3 yes. I've talked myself into yes and no this week alone. So I'm really very much on the fence here, although I think it's super cool. But Jacob has this dream that looks just like that, except that it's angels ascending and descending. He's given the imagination that heaven is deeply connected to earth, and that which is from earth ascends into heaven, and that which is from heaven descends onto earth. And at the very top is the voice of the Lord giving him a promise that is the promise of his grandfather that remains for him as well. Your descendants will return here. Your people will live here. As surely as you are here and I am your God, you will be blessed, both you and your offspring. Jacob wakes up from it and has an incredible religious experience. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware. Now, I wonder if he had been aware before, if he hadn't been such a manipulator, if he had just have taken God's promise given to his mom and let it unfold. Instead, he needed to take it for himself. How much, I wonder, when Jacob says this, does Jacob look back upon his life? And he's not just saying this place, but this place is in the earth which the angels are descending to. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware. God was a concept, and now he's been made real to him. But even as God is made real, and even as Jacob worships by pouring oil over a rock, even as Jacob understands how intricately connected God's promise is to his life now, Jacob still can't quite stop his manipulating. You see, even in this story, Jacob could just say, God has met me, God has promised me, and I believe what God says. But Jacob's vow doesn't quite seem to be a full accepting of God's promises. I tell you what, God, if you keep me safe on this journey, if you give me food and clothes to wear, if I return safely, then I will give you a tenth of it. What? God just showed up in unbelievably vivid ways to Jacob and has told him in no uncertain terms that what Jacob is promising will happen. So Jacob asks for it in a certain way and offers back only a tenth. God has given him a vision for him and his descendants receiving this land, the best land in the entire region, a land that we will find is flowing with milk and honey, where beautiful crops can be planted. And Jacob promises, about a tenth of that back to God. It's as if God showing up in such a mighty way isn't quite enough for Jacob to fully put his trust. He needs the next few steps to be cared for as well. So Jacob takes off from that place. He glimpses heaven, he worships, he makes a vow, and he continues on his way. And for as much as we could critique this vow, there is something truly beautiful about that process and one that we could take for ourselves. So often when we find ourselves in the midst of a worship experience that's grand and it feels as though the heavens have opened and descended upon us, we want to stay there in the bliss of that moment. But God doesn't create moments that are perpetual. God shows up in a moment for a time and for a reason. And we're invited into a worship process here that is powerful. We glimpse heaven, we worship it, we promise to God ourselves, and then we continue on our way, with God seeming to expect that his revelation to us is enough to sustain us in him, no matter what the next struggle will be. In the next struggle, we don't say, God, where are you now? We look back in our moments of worship and we say, surely God is in this place. He was there then, he is here now. Our moments where God meets us is to sustain us in the coming days. And Jacob would need it in the coming days, because Jacob is soon to find that he's not the only one who can manipulate in his family. He heads back to his homeland where his mother is from, and he runs into this beautiful woman, a gorgeous woman, a woman that he is sure he wants to marry. In fact, his first meeting of her, we're told they're already kissing. It's not clear if this is a greeting on the cheek or if this is a passionate embrace. It just says that they kiss. And to me, that seems pretty forward in a first meeting. And yet Jacob is sure that he wants to marry this beautiful Rachel. So he finds Laban, his kinman, and begins to negotiate to marry Rachel. And Laban says, I would love for you to marry my daughter, but first you must give me 7 years of work on my land in order to have this wedding that you want. Now, I don't generally think that 7-year engagements is a good idea. But Jacob was in love. So he was willing to work the land, the hardest labor possible, because at the end of his 7 years was the beautiful Rachel. And when the time came, 7 years of hard work on Laban's land with Laban's livestock, the wedding came. And down the aisle comes Laban's daughter, and Jacob is so excited to finally receive his Rachel. And then finally the night passes, and the marriage is consummated. And he wakes up the next morning, and he looks upon his lovely Rachel, and he finds the not-so-lovely older daughter. And Jacob begins to think about the pact that he's made. And he runs to Laban and he says, I wanted to marry Rachel. You knew that. And Laban said, oh, yes, and I promised you my daughter. What? Well, you see, Jacob, it's our custom that the oldest gets what is first. Oh, that's interesting, because that was the custom in Jacob's family too, but he stole it. And here, Jacob receives exactly what he gave. He receives the older daughter because Laban only promised his daughter, never specifically Rachel, playing on Jacob's assumptions that Laban knew that Rachel was the one he wanted. But Laban's not done manipulating. Laban's not done manipulating. Well, I see that Leah's just okay to you. I mean, I needed to have her loved and cared for. You'll do a fine job, but if you want Rachel too, how about you work 7 more years and we can have another wedding ceremony next week? Now, fathers, mothers, I don't recommend you doing this with your daughters. Marrying both of your girls off to the same man doesn't seem like a very good idea. But Laban is getting some pretty solid labor out of this deal. And so that seems to be the currency that he's peddling and yearns for. And so they have another wedding ceremony the very next week, and Jacob goes back to work for 7 more years. In ancient Jewish midrash, there's a story that gets into Jacob's manipulating. It goes like this. It says, all night long he kept calling Rachel, and Leah kept answering yes. The next morning, behold, it is Leah. He said, liar and daughter of liar. She answered, can there be a schoolmaster without pupils? Was it not this way to your father when he called out for Esau and you answered him? Even the ancient Jews knew that Jacob had been undone by his own game. So Jacob ends up putting in 14 years of work in order to marry 2 women. And in these second 7 years, much of his life is colored by fertility, but never the fertility of the one he loved. And so Leah, amazingly, is just capable of having babies with Jacob. Son upon son upon son starts coming out, and Rachel is getting jealous. And so Rachel pulls another trick out of the family's past. She starts seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 baby boys born to her sister that Jacob doesn't even love, but apparently is spending the evening with occasionally. And Rachel wants to have a baby of her own and cannot have one. And so she calls upon one of her servants. Why don't you go have my baby with Jacob? And Jacob, a dunce, as like his father and grandfather, says, okay. And he has a child with that. And he finds that that son is not satisfying either. Now, Leah has slowly stopped having babies. So then she sends her servant into the mix as well to have another baby. Now we've got 1 wife that he loves and 3 baby mamas. It is getting complicated. And yet Jacob just keeps going on and on and on, having son after son after son with, we're told later, some daughters mixed in between. That's a lot of pregnancy in one tent in the ancient world. And all this time, Jacob is working and working and working to pay back Laban. Jacob finally starts getting the hint that things aren't going right with Laban. Laban's attitude has changed. And Jacob doesn't particularly like bringing about wealth to a man that isn't himself. So he goes and he makes this pact with Laban. He says, I tell you what, I will continue breeding all of the livestock, the sheep, the calves, I'll do all of the work. And all of the plain colored ones you can have, and I'll take all the spotted secondary ones that you don't even really want that much. And Laban is like, ka-ching, what a deal is that? Yeah, let's do it. Pure ones without spots are more likely to be born. There should be more of them. They're more desirable. They're stronger. They're better looking. And they're more numerous. Let's do it. Except that Jacob gets back to his manipulative behaviors. He starts breeding them in such a way that the spotted ones are birthed more often. And that over time, more and more of these secondary ones are born. And eventually Laban comes out and he looks upon all of the livestock and he's like, I've been swindled. I made a deal that was good for me, and somehow Jacob has made it as such that it's good for him. And so Laban gets mad, and Jacob realizes he's mad. And so he takes his 2 wives, Laban's 2 daughters, he takes all of the livestock that he's created for himself, and he takes off back to his homeland. Off they go. And now Jacob is caught once again in this place of exile in between 2 families. But Jacob has one very serious problem. He's running from Laban, who wants to kill him, but he's running to Esau, who wants to kill him. And so now Jacob has made a bit of a name for himself and has created a little bit of wealth for himself. He's got some boys, which is really a good thing in the ancient world. But he's now caught between 2 families, 2 family members that he's manipulated. And both of them are out to kill him. And it's in this moment, this in-between place, this exile, this between 2 places that God meets Jacob again. And it's in the same place at Bethel. But this time, God doesn't come with a beautiful apocalyptic vision of heaven meeting earth. This time, God comes down as a WWE wrestler who wants to throw Jacob around a little bit. I have been that man before, who in order to get God's attention, I needed to be tossed around a little bit. Or to get the attention, have gotten God's attention. God comes down and grabs Jacob and starts wrestling him. And Jacob fights back. And they wrestle and throw each other through the entire night. They fight and they fight and they wrestle. And Jacob keeps battling rather than submitting. And when their battle is over, Jacob is hurt in a tendon in his hip. But God blesses him once more. He changes his name and therefore changes his trajectory. He says, your name will now be Israel, because you have battled and wrestled and struggled with both God and man and have overcome. Jacob is now Israel, and Israel, the people, has now come alive through Jacob. It's unbelievable to me that Jacob's life has not precluded him from God's blessing. God does not look upon Jacob and say, maybe I got this wrong. God has decided in a covenant with Abraham that this family is to be his people. And the worst mistakes, the worst back and forth, the biggest manipulations they could do not preclude God from continuing to work in and through them. It's possible that your life looks a whole lot like Jacob's. You may know that God is blessing you, out to be with you, out to know you, but you battle and you wrestle God instead of submitting. But God's history is to not give up just because we battle and wrestle. Jacob receives this blessing and now understands himself to be Israel. He ends up having 12 kids in all, 12 sons, I should say, from 4 different mothers, because Rachel eventually conceives. And when Rachel conceives, it's the 11th boy, and his name is Joseph. You may know Joseph from the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, also hopefully the Bible. But the reason that Joseph, the 11th boy, is the favorite is because finally the woman that Jacob really loved all along, the one he truly wanted to make a family with, birthed the son. And that's why Jacob loves him so. I don't know that it's particularly fair for him to choose out one of 12 boys to make a favorite, but it's also not particularly hard to see why Joseph is his favorite. And now he's armed with 12 boys, and these 12 boys become the fathers of the tribes of Israel. Israel, the people of God, God's holy nation, his chosen, elected people. Out of this chaos, And the problem is with the story is that Israel never quite gets their chaos under control. Generations upon generations seem to follow the curse of the generation before them. And God from this point on sends prophets and priests and kings asking Israel to repent of their idolatrous behavior, their manipulative behavior. And they always seem to be sort of rooted in the beginning that they were given. But God never gives up on them, just like he never gives up on Jacob. And so the sin of the people never precludes them from God's relationship with them. But God's call for them constantly is to repent from the mistakes that they've been handed so that they could turn from their wicked ways and follow God in the way that he has called them to be. The story of Jacob ends up as a really good and happy story, however. He runs into Laban, and Laban, after chasing him, doesn't kill him, but says, "You've taken my daughters and my grandkids from me. Can't we have a relationship with each other so that I can be in relationship with my daughters and grandchildren?" And he and Jacob make up. He runs into Esau, and Esau somehow, I would love to know the story of Esau. Esau is just kind of forgotten for like 20 years, but he shows up with a whole army. Who knows what he's up to? But that guy sounds terrifying. And Jacob runs into him and his 12 gangly little boys, and they're like, "All right, army, let's go." And Esau comes and he hugs his brother, and they forgive one another, and they enter back into relationship with each other. All of the manipulation of Jacob's life ends with people demonstrating forgiveness to him and relationship being restored to one another. I don't know if you are a manipulator or if you're one who feels manipulated, but living a life that way is not one that leads to great endings. Frankly, if it weren't for the forgiveness of his uncle and his brother, Jacob could have ended up dead in the middle of the exile in the desert. Forgiveness is the only way to move past a life of manipulation. Facing up to those that you've hurt and offering forgiveness to the ones who have hurt you are the ways to break cycles like the one that Jacob found himself in. But what's amazing is for all of the cycles that caused Jacob trouble, God works through them. God is at work to continue his promise through him. He provides him with 12 boys to create the tribes. He gives him wealth. God opens the land for Jacob to be welcomed back into it. And when the next famine comes, we know we've been talking about famines, his loved son, Joseph, will rise up to take care of him and give him long days and long years. Jacob is the blessed one. He is the plan. He continues the way forward. He messes it up over and over and over. You are God's child. God loves you. God plans to work through you. His covenant with earth to let all of earth into relationship includes you. No matter how much manipulating, no matter how much messing up, no matter how many mistakes you've made. We learn in Jacob that God does not give up on his plans because we have stepped out of our relationship, even if for a moment with God. God continues to work in and through us and for an end that looks like reconciliation. The question is, will we submit to that? Will we give ourselves to the life that God has called us to, bathing ourselves in the promises that God has given us? Or are we going to take things into our own hands? When Jacob takes things into his own hands, exile and chaos and more manipulation follows. When God is leading the charge, forgiveness, restoration, renewedness wins. We have a choice before us. And we've got great forefathers which we can study and see the way that God works even when we're at our worst. And we can remember that God is tailoring even our mistakes towards a more preferable and vibrant future. Would you join me in praying as we lead into singing today? Lord, help us to look at this story of Jacob. Help us to look and see find ourselves in it, and help us, Lord, to be one who is righteous, who follows you, who trusts you, who believes you when you say you are with us and not against us. And help us to live into that promise, fully trusting in your presence and your call. And help us, Lord, to not take things into our own hands, lest that we would fall and struggle, make mistakes, and disappoint you. May you continue to chase us, and would you even give us moments like the two in Bethel, that we would know you and see you, and give us a taste and a call to trust you. We praise you, Lord. We thank you. Amen.